The death certificate was forged on a Tuesday. By Friday, Lord Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Renmore, had locked himself in his study and refused to eat. He sat in the dark with a single candle and a glass of brandy he never touched, and he read her name on the paper over and over again as though repetition might change what it said. Cecily Ann Vane, departed this world the 14th of March, 1806, age 19. He had loved her since she was 16. He had planned to marry her in the spring. He had written her a letter just 4 days before, a ridiculous letter, embarrassingly tender, full of promises he intended to keep for the rest of his life. She never wrote back. Now he knew why, except he didn't. Not really. Not the truth. No one told him the truth. No one ever did. Not until 17 years later, when a young woman knocked on the doors of Renmore House on a gray November morning and said 7 words that stopped Edmund Ashford's heart in his chest. "Your Grace, Cecily Vane is still alive." The morning of Cecily Vane's funeral was unreasonably beautiful. Edmund remembered that later, how offensive it seemed, the pale gold sunlight falling across the churchyard, the birds carrying on as though nothing had ended. As though the world had not, in the span of 4 days, become a completely unrecognizable place. He stood at the graveside in his black coat with his hands clasped behind his back, the way his father had taught him a gentleman stands when he must not fall apart in public. He was 22 years old. He had never lost anyone before. He did not know yet that grief had a physical weight to it, that it settled in the chest like something swallowed wrong and simply stayed there. The coffin was closed. He had asked quietly, privately, hat in hand, if he might see her one last time. Lady Vane had looked at him with those pale, still eyes of hers and said the illness had been very hard on her, that it was better this way, that Cecily would not have wanted him to remember her like that. Edmund had nodded. He was a gentleman. He did not argue with a grieving mother. He wished, in the years that followed, that he had. The Vane family was not wealthy. That had never mattered to Edmund, though it had mattered enormously to his father, the previous Duke of Renmore, a man who measured the worth of a family almost entirely by the acreage of their estate and the depth of their coffers. Edmund and his father had argued about Cecily, not loudly, not in the dramatic fashion of novels, but in the quiet, grinding way of 2 people who love each other and cannot agree on anything that matters. "She is an earl's daughter," Edmund had said. "A very minor earl," his father had replied, "with very considerable debts." But Edmund had been stubborn in the particular way of young men who have just discovered they are capable of loving someone, and he had pressed on. He had called on Cecily every Tuesday and Thursday. He had walked with her in the park with her younger sister, trailing behind them as a chaperone little Harriet who was only 6 years old and more interested in chasing pigeons than in watching them. He had read poetry aloud to Cecily badly, and she had laughed at him for it, and he had found, to his own surprise, that being laughed at by her felt better than being admired by anyone else. He had written to her father. He had received a cautious, careful reply, and then she had died. The service was brief. Lady Vane did not weep. Edmund noticed that, filed it somewhere in the back of his mind without knowing what to do with it. She stood very straight, very composed, her gloved hands folded at her waist, her eyes fixed on the middle distance. Grief took people differently, Edmund told himself. Some people went to pieces. Others turned to stone. He told himself that for a long time afterward. He was wrong, but he did not know it yet. What he knew was this. When the last prayer was said and the small gathering began to drift away through the churchyard gate, Edmund stayed. He stood at the edge of the grave until the sexton grew uncomfortable and began to shuffle his feet. He stood there because leaving felt like agreeing to something he wasn't ready to agree to. Cecily was gone. He was supposed to go on living. He wasn't sure, standing there in the unreasonable March sunshine, how a person was supposed to do that. He managed it in the end, the way people manage most impossible things, badly, and then gradually, and then well enough that the outside world could not tell the difference. He threw himself into the business of the dukedom with the focus of a man who has decided that feeling nothing is preferable to feeling too much. His father died the following year, heart failure, sudden, in the middle of dinner, and Edmund became the Duke of Renmore at 23, which gave him so much to do that he was almost grateful for it. He did not pursue another attachment. His mother suggested several candidates over the years, and he listened to all of them with the same polite, empty attention he gave to reports from his estate managers. He smiled at the right moments. He said all the correct things. He remained, gently and immovably, alone. His mother called it stubbornness. His closest friend, Lord Bexley, called it something less flattering after his third glass of port one evening. Edmund called it nothing at all. He simply lived his life and managed his estates and did not allow himself to think about Cecily Vane more than once or twice a week. That was the best he could do. He had decided enough. He was wrong about that too, but that revelation, like so many others, was still 17 years away. In the churchyard on that golden March morning, he finally put his hat back on. He turned away from the grave. He went home. And in a small cottage in Yorkshire, 300 miles north, a girl with no name and no past opened her eyes for the first time in 4 days, looked at the unfamiliar ceiling above her, and tried very hard to remember who she was. The ceiling was made of uneven plaster, and it had a crack in it shaped like a river. That was the first thing Cecily saw when she opened her eyes, that crack, running from the corner of the room to somewhere above her head, branching once near the middle like a tributary finding its way. She stared at it for a long time. It seemed important to focus on something that was not moving because everything else, the light, the shadows, the edges of the room, seemed to shift and blur whenever she tried to look directly at it. Her throat hurt. Her head hurt worse. She tried to sit up and discovered that her arms did not have the strength for it. Be still. The voice came from somewhere to her left. Low, unhurried, the voice of a woman accustomed to not repeating herself. Cecily turned her head slowly because her neck ached and found a woman sitting in a wooden chair beside the bed. She was perhaps 60, with gray hair pinned severely back and sharp dark eyes that were watching Cecily with an expression that gave away very little. Cecily did not recognize her. "Who are you?" she tried to say. What came out was something closer to a dry scrape of sound. The woman stood, poured water from a jug on the table nearby, and helped Cecily drink it with the brisk efficiency of someone who has done this many times and does not require thanks for it. "There," she said when Cecily had finished. "You've been ill for 4 days. Fever broke this morning. You are not to exert yourself. 4 days." Cecily looked at the ceiling again. The crack, the river, where am I? She managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Safe," the woman said. "That isn't what I asked." Something shifted in the woman's expression, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She sat back down in her chair and folded her hands in her lap and offered nothing else. The cottage was small and clean, and told Cecily almost nothing useful about where she was or how she had come to be in it. She pieced together what she could in those first slow days, when she was still too weak to do much more than lie still and observe. There was one main room with a fireplace and a scrubbed wooden table, a narrow kitchen beyond a half-open door, 2 windows that looked out onto gray sky and the edge of a field, and in the distance, the dark suggestion of hills she did not recognize. Not London. Not anywhere near London. The woman's name, she learned, was Mrs. Holt. She cooked plain food and brought it on a tray and sat with Cecily in the evenings, sometimes reading, sometimes simply present in the particular way of people who are comfortable with silence. She answered questions with the careful economy of someone who has decided in advance exactly how much to say and will not be moved beyond it. "How did I get here?" "You were brought." "By whom?" "People who wished you well." "Why?" A pause. "That will be explained to you when you are stronger." Cecily had been raised to be patient. She had been raised to be agreeable and soft-spoken, and to trust that the adults in her life were acting in her best interest. She had, on the whole, been a cooperative sort of girl. Lying in that narrow bed in that strange cottage, staring at the cracked ceiling, she felt something shift inside her, something that had perhaps always been there, underneath the agreeableness, waiting. She did not feel cooperative at all. On the 6th day, she was well enough to sit up. On the 8th, to walk to the window. The hills in the distance were moors. She understood then, in a general way, that she was somewhere in the north of England. The air that came through the gap in the window frame was cold and sharp and smelled of nothing she recognized, no coal smoke, no river, no city, just grass and stone and open sky. She had never been this far from London in her life. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and tried to think clearly. She remembered the Tuesday before. She remembered feeling unwell at dinner, a dizziness, a sudden heat behind her eyes. She remembered her mother's hands, surprisingly firm, guiding her upstairs. She remembered a doctor she did not recognize. She remembered a glass of something bitter pressed to her lips, and then nothing, until the ceiling, until the crack shaped like a river. She thought about Edmund. She thought about the letter she had received from him the day before she fell ill, folded into her pocket, pressed against her heart with the particular tenderness of a girl who is not yet accustomed to being loved by someone she loves in return. She had read it 3 times. She had planned to write back that same evening. She did not know, standing at that window on that cold March morning, that Edmund was at that same moment standing at her grave. She did not know that she was dead. Not yet. Mrs. Holt told her on the 10th day. She did it without preface, without softening, in the same direct manner she did everything. She sat down across from Cecily at the small table, poured tea for both of them, and said, "There is something you need to know, and I am going to tell you plainly because I believe you are a girl who prefers plain things." Cecily wrapped both hands around her cup. "Go on." "Your family has told everyone that you died. There was a funeral. A certificate was filed. As far as London is concerned, you no longer exist." The words landed in a strange order in Cecily's mind, as though they had arrived separately and needed to be arranged. "My family," she said. "Your mother arranged it." "My mother." "Yes." Cecily set down her cup very carefully. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were completely steady. She was not sure what that meant about her. "And my father." Mrs. Holt's expression shifted. "Your father did not know. Your father is not," she stopped, chose different words. "Your father was not in a position to prevent it." There was something in that pause that Cecily filed away to examine later. "And Edmund." The name came out smaller than she intended, almost inaudible. Mrs. Holt looked at her steadily. "Lord Ashford believes you are dead." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved across the moors in a long, low sweep. Cecily sat very still and looked at the grain of the wooden table and breathed in and breathed out with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided not to come apart in front of a stranger. "Why," she said at last, "would my mother do this?" "That," Mrs. Holt said quietly, "is a longer answer. And I promise you will have it, but not today." "When?" "When the right person comes to tell you." Cecily looked up. "And who is the right person?" Mrs. Holt looked back at her with those sharp, unreadable eyes. She did not answer. That evening, after Mrs. Holt had gone to bed, Cecily sat alone by the fire for a very long time. She thought about her mother's still, dry eyes at, she supposed, her own funeral. She thought about the doctor she had not recognized. She thought about Edmund, who did not know, who was grieving, who was probably at this very moment sitting in the dark somewhere being absolutely destroyed by something that had not even happened. She thought about all of that. And then she did something she had not done since she was a small child. She pressed her fist against her mouth, and she let herself cry, not quietly, not politely, but in great shaking silent waves that went on until there was nothing left in her chest but a hollow, scoured-out feeling. When it was over, she wiped her face. She straightened her back. And she made herself a promise, alone in that firelit room in the middle of the strange, cold north. She was going to find out why, all of it, every piece, and then she was going to decide what to do with the truth. She did not know, sitting there in the dark with her red eyes and her steady hands, that it would take her 17 years to get the answer. She did not know that by then everything would be different. She did not know that Mrs. Holt, quiet, careful, plain-spoken Mrs. Holt, who brought her soup on a tray and refused to answer the questions that mattered, had once, 20 years ago, been employed in the nursery of Renmore House. That she had changed Edmund Ashford's nappies. That she had taught him to walk. That she had loved that boy like a son, and had spent the last 10 days trying very hard not to think about what she had agreed to do to him. The room smelled of camphor and old roses and something else underneath, something Harriet Vane had come to associate in these last difficult weeks with endings. She was 23 years old. She had never known her sister. She had grown up with a grave instead. Their mother lay in the large bed by the window, propped against pillows, her face the color of old wax. She had been declining since August, slowly at first, then with the sudden urgency of a candle burning down to its last inch. The doctors came and went with their measured expressions and their careful noncommitments, and Harriet sat in the chair beside the bed every evening and read aloud, and held the thin hand resting on the coverlet and tried to make peace with the fact that she was about to be entirely alone in the world. Their father had died 4 years ago. There were no brothers, no close relatives who amounted to anything practical, just Harriet and her mother. And the grave in St. Michael's churchyard with her sister's name on it, Cecily Ann Vane, beloved daughter, 1787-1806. Harriet had grown up visiting that grave. She had brought flowers every March on the anniversary because her mother always seemed to forget, and Harriet had decided early on that someone ought to remember. She had invented a sister in her mind over the years, pieced her together from a miniature portrait on the mantelpiece and the occasional, carefully rationed story her mother would tell on quiet evenings. Cecily had been gentle. Cecily had been clever. Cecily had played the pianoforte beautifully. Cecily had died before Harriet was old enough to know her. That was the story. That had always been the story. It was a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of October when Lady Vane asked Harriet to close the door. Harriet looked up from her book. Her mother's eyes were open, clearer than they had been in days, with the particular sharpness that sometimes came near the end, as though the body, releasing everything else, released its grip on the mind as well. Harriet set down her book and closed the door and came back to her chair. Her mother watched her the whole way. "I need to tell you something," Lady Vane said. Her voice was thin but steady, the voice of a woman who has been rehearsing. "You should rest, Mama." "I have rested enough." A pause. The thin hand moved on the coverlet, restless. "I have rested for 17 years in a manner of speaking, and it has not agreed with me." Harriet did not know what that meant. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Her mother looked at the window. The evening light was gray and flat, October doing what October does. When she spoke again, she did not look at Harriet. "Cecily is not dead." The silence that followed was the strangest Harriet had ever sat inside. She was aware of the fire, the clock on the mantelpiece, her own breathing. She was aware of her mother's profile against the pillow, the sharp nose, the closed eyes now, as though saying it aloud had cost her the last of whatever she'd been holding together. "I'm sorry," Harriet said at last, very carefully. "What did you say? You heard me. Mama." "She is alive." The eyes opened again, fixed on Harriet with an intensity that was almost frightening. "She has been alive this entire time. I need you to understand that before I explain anything else, because the explanation is a breath. The explanation is not simple, and I need you to hear the whole of it before you speak." Harriet thought of the grave in St. Michael's churchyard, the flowers she had brought every March for 17 years. She pressed her hands flat against her knees and said nothing. Her mother began to talk. It had started, Lady Vane said, with her husband's debts. Not small debts, not the ordinary sort of financial embarrassment that a good season or a fortunate card game might resolve. These were the catastrophic kind, the kind that had been accumulating quietly for years behind a facade of respectability, growing in the dark the way rot grows, until one morning in the winter of 1805, a man had come to the house and laid out the full extent of them on the desk in her husband's study. That man had been the late Duke of Renmore, Edmund's father. He knew everything, Lady Vane said, every debt, every creditor. He had been buying them up for months without our knowledge. He held it all. He could have destroyed your father with a word: bankruptcy, disgrace, prison, everything gone. Harriet's hands tightened on her knees. Why would he do that? Because your father had something he wanted. What could Papa possibly have? A letter. Lady Vane's voice was flat now, drained of everything except the bare facts. Your father had come into possession, quite accidentally, of a letter written by the Duke of Renmore to a member of Parliament. The contents were— she paused. They were the sort of contents that end careers, end freedom. The Duke wanted that letter back, and your father, God help him, had been foolish enough to think it made him powerful. It made him a target, Harriet said quietly. Yes, a long breath. The Duke came to our house. He was very calm. He said he would forgive every debt, all of it gone, as though it had never existed, in exchange for the letter. And one other thing. Harriet felt something cold settle at the base of her spine. He wanted Edmund's attachment to Cecily ended. Permanently, cleanly. He had another match in mind for his son, a girl with a title and an estate and connections your father could never offer. He did not want Cecily in the way, but he could not simply forbid Edmund. A thin, humorless sound that might have been a laugh. Edmund was stubborn even then. A broken engagement would have caused a scene. Edmund would have fought, so he had to believe she was dead, Harriet said. The words came out very steady. She was surprised by that. Yes, her mother whispered. He had to grieve her and move on. That was the condition. Cecily would disappear. A death certificate would be arranged. The Duke had the connections for it. A funeral, a grave, and then silence. She closed her eyes. Your father refused at first, but not at the end. No, not at the end. There was a long pause. The fire shifted and settled. Harriet stood up and walked to the window because she needed to be doing something with her body, and looking out at the dark street below seemed as good as anything. Where was Cecily taken? She asked. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, very far away. Yorkshire. There was a woman, a Mrs. Holt, who agreed to take her. She had once worked for the Ashford family. The Duke trusted her to be discreet. She was paid well. A pause. She was also, I believe, the only person in this entire arrangement who genuinely cared what happened to Cecily. And Cecily herself. Harriet turned from the window. She simply agreed to this. She was given no choice. She was made ill first, drugged, to be plain about it. She woke up in Yorkshire with no memory of how she got there, and a woman she didn't know telling her that her family had declared her dead. The cold thing at the base of Harriet's spine spread outward. She must have been terrified. She must have been, her mother agreed. And there it was, finally, the crack in the voice, the first fracture in 17 years of composure. I told myself it was the only way. I told myself she would have a life, a quiet life, but a life. I told myself— she stopped, swallowed. I told myself many things, Harriet. I was very good at it for a very long time. Harriet looked at her mother, at this woman she had loved unreservedly for 23 years, this woman who had seemed to her always a little sad, a little distant, a little haunted in ways she could never quite explain. Now she understood the haunting. Does Cecily know why? She asked. Does she know the reason? I don't know what Mrs. Holt told her. We have not— the voice dropped. I have not communicated with Mrs. Holt since the first year. I could not. Every letter felt like she did not finish. Like evidence, Harriet said, or like guilt. Her mother said nothing, which was, Harriet thought, an answer. I need you to find her, Lady Vane said after a while. Harriet turned back to the window. Outside, a carriage was moving slowly down the wet street, its lantern throwing a small circle of yellow light onto the cobblestones. You want me to find the sister I was told was dead, she said, who has been living under a false name in Yorkshire for 17 years, because you are dying and you want to be forgiven. The silence that followed was answer enough. Harriet watched the carriage until it rounded the corner and disappeared. She thought about the grave, the flowers, the miniature portrait on the mantelpiece, and the carefully rationed stories, and the sister she had invented in her mind, because she had nothing else to work with. She thought about Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Renmore, who had apparently loved Cecily enough that his own father had considered him an obstacle that needed to be managed. She had seen him once at a distance, at a function the previous winter. Tall, dark, impeccably correct in every visible way, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to keep everything important entirely out of sight. She thought about 17 years, about what 17 years did to a person, about what it must have done to both of them. "There is one more thing," her mother said. Harriet closed her eyes briefly. "Of course there is." The Duke of Renmore, Edmund's father, he did not act alone in the planning of this. The arrangements, the certificate, the contacts in Yorkshire. A pause that seemed to cost something. Your father helped him. Willingly in the end, for the debts, for the letter being returned, for the safety of this family. Another pause. Edmund does not know his father's part in it. He has never known. He believes Cecily died of illness. He has believed that for 17 years. Harriet opened her eyes. "So he has been grieving," she said slowly, "a death that two men he trusted engineered between them." "Yes. And when he learns that, he will be angry," her mother said simply. "He should be angry. He has every right to be." Harriet thought about that stillness she had noticed in him, across a crowded room at a winter function. The particular stillness of a man who has put something away and locked the door on it. She wondered what happened when you unlocked that door. She supposed she was about to find out. Lady Vane died 4 days later, on a quiet Sunday morning, with Harriet's hand in hers. She did not ask for forgiveness again. Harriet thought perhaps she had given up expecting it, which was either honest or cowardly or both, depending on the angle from which you looked at it. Harriet sat with her for a long time after. Then she went to her writing desk and found the address she needed, an old letter retrieved from the very bottom of her mother's correspondence box, the ink faded, the handwriting careful and anonymous. Mrs. E. Holt, Thornfield Cottage, near Hawksmoor, North Yorkshire. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the miniature portrait on the mantelpiece. The painted girl with the dark eyes and the almost smile, forever 19, forever unchanging. "I'm coming," Harriet said, to the portrait, to the address, to the sister she had never known and had always, in some wordless way, missed. She began to pack. She did not write to Edmund Ashford first. She told herself it was because she needed to find Cecily before she could tell him anything with certainty. She told herself it was practical, sensible, the correct order of operations. She did not let herself think about the other reason, that she was not at all sure, standing in her dead mother's bedroom with a faded address in her hand. How you told a man that the woman he had mourned for 17 years was alive, or how you told him who had put her in the ground. Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Renmore, did not consider himself an unhappy man. He had considered the question carefully over the years. In the dispassionate way he approached most things, turning it over, examining it from several angles, arriving at a conclusion he was reasonably satisfied with. Unhappy implied a lack, a want, some specific thing missing that, if restored, would set everything right. Edmund did not experience his life that way. He experienced it as complete, fully furnished, adequately lit, functioning without obvious fault. If certain rooms in it remained permanently closed, that was simply architecture. He was 40 years old. He ran his estates with precision and his finances with something approaching elegance. He sat in the House of Lords and said useful things at useful moments and was regarded, by those whose regard was worth having, as a man of considerable substance and reliable judgment. He had friends, not many, but good ones, which he had always understood to be the correct ratio. He had his library and his horses and a cook who understood that he preferred his dinners simple and his breakfasts left entirely alone. It was a good life. He was almost certain it was a good life. Lord Bexley arrived on a Tuesday morning in November without warning, which was his habit and Edmund's longest-standing grievance against him. He was shown into the library where Edmund was working, dropped into the chair across the desk without being invited, and helped himself to the coffee that had been meant for Edmund. "You look terrible," he said pleasantly. "Thank you, Bexley. I mean it as an observation, not an insult. When did you last sleep properly? I sleep perfectly well. You have the eyes of a man who has been staring at ledgers since 4 in the morning. I have been staring at ledgers since 5, Edmund said, which is an important distinction. Bexley looked at him over the rim of the coffee cup with the expression he had been deploying for 20 years, fond, slightly exasperated, entirely undeceived. He was one of the few people Edmund had never successfully managed to present a convincing front to, which was either the foundation of their friendship or its most irritating feature, depending on the day. Your mother called on my wife yesterday, Bexley said. Edmund set down his pen. Did she? She is concerned about the Pemberton situation. Edmund said nothing. He was aware of the Pemberton situation. He was, in fact, acutely aware of it in the way one is aware of a stone in one's shoe, present at every step, impossible to ignore for long, manageable only through the sustained application of deliberate inattention. Lord Pemberton had a daughter. Lady Pemberton had spent the last 6 months maneuvering that daughter into every social occasion Edmund was obliged to attend. His mother had begun making remarks at dinner, carefully positioned remarks, nothing so direct as a statement, just small, well-placed suggestions, like furniture being rearranged one piece at a time. Edmund was 40 years old. He was a duke. He did not have an heir. He was aware of what was expected of him. He was also aware, in the same quiet, locked-away part of himself where he kept everything that mattered, that he had been aware of what was expected of him for 17 years and had not yet managed to want it. The Pemberton girl is perfectly acceptable, he said. High praise. I am not in the business of high praise, Bexley. No, Bexley set down the cup. His voice shifted not dramatically, just a degree or two toward something more serious. Edmund, it has been 17 years. I am aware of how long it has been. You cannot, he stopped, started again. She would not have wanted this. Edmund looked at him steadily. We will not discuss this. We never discuss it. That is precisely the problem. Bexley. The single word, quiet and final, closed the door on the subject the way it always did. Bexley recognized it. He had been recognizing it for 17 years, and he subsided, not because he was convinced, but because he had learned that Edmund's silences were structural, load-bearing. You did not remove them without bringing down whatever they were holding up. He picked up the coffee cup again. The Pembertons are hosting a dinner on Friday, he said, in a different tone entirely. I told my wife we would come. I may have implied you would join us. You may have implied incorrectly. Edmund. A pause. Outside, a November wind moved through the street, rattling the window glass. Fine, Edmund said. He picked up his pen. Friday. He went to the dinner. He was perfectly civil. He sat next to Miss Pemberton, who was 24 and pretty and clever enough to carry a conversation without requiring him to do all the work, which he appreciated. He smiled at the right moments. He asked her about her interests and listened to the answers with genuine, if limited, attention. He did exactly what was required of him for 3 hours and then came home and sat in his library until 2 in the morning, not reading the book that was open in front of him. He was not unhappy. He was not. He simply could not seem to want things. That was all. He had tried at various points, and the wanting never materialized into anything he could act on, because every time he reached for it there was something in the way, not a memory exactly, or not only a memory, but a kind of shape where a memory had been, an outline, the place where something had lived before it was gone. He had been 22 years old. He had loved her with the absolute, uncomplicated certainty of someone who has not yet learned that certainty is a luxury. He did not think about that. He was very practiced at not thinking about it. He closed the book and went to bed. The letter from his solicitor arrived on Thursday. It was not an unusual letter in itself. Barlow had been his father's solicitor before him, an old firm, thorough and discreet, the sort of establishment that dealt in wills and property transfers and the occasional delicate personal matter with equal impenetrability. The letter pertained to a small matter of the Renmore entail, something to be signed, nothing requiring urgent attention. Edmund signed the relevant document and set it aside, and was about to move on to the rest of his correspondence when something made him stop. He looked at Barlow's name on the letterhead. He thought, without intending to, about his father. This happened occasionally, not often but occasionally, a sudden unwilled recollection of the previous Duke of Renmore, a large man, a certain kind of confident, the sort of person who filled a room not through charm but through the absolute assurance that the room was his to fill. Edmund had admired him enormously as a child, had spent years trying to meet the specific standard his father represented, had gradually, as he grew older, begun to notice certain things. Small things, inconsistencies, moments where his father's explanation for something had not quite aligned with what Edmund had later come to understand about it. He had never examined those moments too closely. His father was dead. Examining them served no purpose. He put the letter in the outgoing pile. He moved on. On the Friday morning, 3 days before Harriet Vane knocked on his door, Edmund did something he did not ordinarily permit himself. He went to St. Michael's churchyard. He did not plan it. He was out riding early, before the city was properly awake, and he found himself in that part of the city, and then he found himself dismounting, and then he found himself inside the gate with the November frost still white on the grass, and his breath making small clouds in the cold air. The stone was simple. He had paid for it himself in those first terrible weeks because her family had not had the means and he had needed to do something with his hands besides shake. Cecily Ann Vane, beloved daughter, 1787-1806. He stood there for a while. He did not speak to the stone. He had never done that. It had always seemed to him a kindness more for the living than the dead, and he was not in the habit of being kind to himself in ways that could not be observed. He simply stood there in the cold and let himself look at her name. 17 years. He had done the arithmetic many times, involuntarily, in the way the mind returns to a bruise. She would have been 36. She would have had, he had imagined it, in his weaker moments, children probably. The particular competence she had brought to everything she attempted. The laugh that had surprised him the first time because it was nothing like what he'd expected from a girl so carefully raised. He would have known her for 17 years. He stood there until his hands went cold. Then he put his hat back on and went home. She came on a Monday. Edmund was in his study when Simmons knocked, his butler, a man of great discretion and minimal expression, who communicated the entirety of his internal life through almost imperceptible variations in posture. His posture now suggested something unexpected. "There is a young woman, Your Grace. She does not have a card. She says it is a personal matter and that you will wish to hear what she has to say." Edmund looked up from his desk. "Name? Miss Harriet Vane, Your Grace." Something happened in Edmund's chest. A small thing. A shift, like a fault line that has been still for a very long time registering the faintest tremor. Vane. He knew the name, of course. He had made it his business in a private and careful way to know what had become of the family. The father had died. The mother recently. He had seen the notice in the paper just last week and had sat with it for longer than he intended. There was a younger sister he had never met. Harriet, he said, almost to himself. She would be, he calculated briefly, 23 now. The child who had been chasing pigeons in the park while he walked with Cecily. "Show her in," he said. She was not what he expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. She was small and dark-haired and serious in a way that reminded him, with a jolt he did not let register on his face, of a miniature portrait he had looked at for a very long time in a very different life. She stood in the doorway of his study with her chin up and her hands clasped in front of her, and regarded him with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing a very difficult conversation and is determined to get through it with their composure intact. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. He sat, a brief silence. "Miss Vane," he said, "I was sorry to read of your mother's passing." "Thank you, Your Grace." Her voice was steady. "I will come directly to the reason I am here if you don't mind. I am not very good at the approach, and I think for what I have to tell you, the direct path is probably kinder. Edmund folded his hands on the desk. By all means, she looked at him. He saw her take a breath, one deliberate, steadying breath. Your Grace, she said, my sister Cecily is still alive. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Edmund did not move, did not speak, did not, as far as he was aware, breathe. He looked at the young woman across his desk and he thought, with the cold clarity of a man who has disciplined his mind for 20 years, that she was either telling the truth or she was not. That one of those options was impossible, that the other one was worse. I beg your pardon, he said. His voice came out entirely level. He was rather amazed by that. She is alive, Harriet said again. She has been living in Yorkshire for 17 years under a false name. She did not choose this. She was a breath. She was hidden by our mother and by someone else. A pause that had weight to it. I will tell you everything, all of it. But I need you to hear me first before you, who else? The two words came out flat and separate, cut from whatever else he might have said. Harriet looked at him. And Edmund, who had not felt anything he could not immediately contain in 17 years, felt something beginning to move in him, something large and long buried and not, he was already certain, going to be quiet about it. Who else? He said again. You said she was hidden by your mother and by someone else. Who? Harriet's hands tightened in her lap. Your father, she said. Your Grace. I'm sorry. It was your father too. Outside the window, London carried on. Inside the study, the Duke of Renmore sat very still for a very long time. And 17 years of carefully maintained architecture began, quietly and irrevocably, to come down. The schoolroom was cold in the mornings. Cecily had learned to arrive early enough to coax the fire into something useful before the children came, 6 of them, ranging from 7 to 13, the sons and daughters of the 3 farming families who made up the better part of Hawksmoor's permanent population. She had been teaching them for 11 years. She knew which ones needed the work set out in small pieces, and which ones needed to be left alone to find their own way to an answer. She knew who cried when frustrated and who went silent, which was worse. She knew their handwriting as well as she knew her own. She was, by any practical measure, good at this. She was, by any practical measure, content. She told herself that regularly. Her name was Margaret Holt now. She had taken Mrs. Holt's name years ago, practically speaking, because Margaret with no surname had raised questions that Margaret Holt did not. The village had accepted her without particular curiosity, which was one of the mercies of small northern places. They were more interested in whether you were useful than in where you had come from, and Cecily had made herself useful with the focused determination of someone who understands that purpose is the nearest available substitute for happiness. She taught the children. She helped Mrs. Holt, who was 73 now and moved more slowly than she once had but remained, in all essential ways, exactly the same, sharp-eyed, plain-spoken, quietly formidable. She kept a small garden. She read everything she could obtain, which was not as much as she would have liked but considerably more than nothing. She played the pianoforte on Sunday evenings on the instrument in the village inn, which was badly tuned and missing one key in the upper register, and which she loved with a fierceness entirely disproportionate to its quality. She did not think about London. She did not think about Edmund. She was very disciplined about both of these things, and if the discipline required more effort on some days than others, if there were mornings when she woke in the gray Yorkshire light with his voice in her ear, particular and clear, reading her a poem badly, she simply got up and lit the fire and got on with things. She was content. She had decided to be content. Mrs. Holt told her about the letter on a Thursday evening. They were sitting after supper, the fire going properly now that winter was settling in, Mrs. Holt with her knitting and Cecily with a book she was not reading, when the old woman set down her needles and said, without preamble, I had a visitor today, while you were at the school. Cecily looked up. Oh, a young woman, dark-haired. She came on the coach from York. A pause. She gave her name as Harriet Vane. The book in Cecily's lap went very still. She is looking for you, Mrs. Holt said. I told her you were not here. She is staying at the inn in the village. The sharp eyes moved to Cecily's face. "She will come back tomorrow. I thought you should know tonight." Cecily set the book on the table beside her chair. She looked at the fire. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she was not usually aware of it, a dull, insistent percussion behind her ribs. Harriet, her sister, the child who had been 6 years old the last time Cecily saw her, running across the park after a pigeon with her arms outstretched, laughing. She would be 23 now. "How did she find me?" Cecily asked. Her voice came out remarkably normal. "Your mother told her," Mrs. Holt said, "before she died." Cecily closed her eyes. Of course it was that. The deathbed confession, the unburdening of guilt, the timing impeccable in the particular way of things that arrived 17 years too late. She stopped. "What does she want? What do you think she wants?" Mrs. Holt said, not unkindly. Cecily opened her eyes. She looked at the fire for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I don't want to be found." Mrs. Holt looked at her for a long time without speaking. This was one of her particular qualities, the willingness to let a silence run until it had said everything it needed to. Cecily had found it maddening in the early years. Now she understood it as a form of respect. "She came a long way," Mrs. Holt said at last. "I know. She lost her mother a fortnight ago. She is alone." "I know that too." Cecily pressed her hands flat against her knees. "I am sorry for it, genuinely," but she stopped, looked for the right words among several inadequate ones. What would she find if I let her? What is there to go back to? My name on a death certificate. 17 years of a life I was not allowed to live. A mother who, she stopped again. "Chose to tell the truth too late," Mrs. Holt said, finishing it for her. "Yes." Another silence. "And Edmund," Mrs. Holt said. Cecily stood up. She went to the window, though there was nothing to see, just her own reflection in the dark glass, older than she still sometimes expected, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there at 19. "He has moved on," she said. "He has had 17 years to move on. He is a duke. He has his estates and his position, and he has not married." Cecily's reflection looked back at her. "You know that," she said. It was not quite a question. "I have kept certain small channels of information open," Mrs. Holt said, with the serene composure of someone admitting to something they do not remotely repent. "Over the years, out of interest, out of guilt," Cecily said. "Perhaps both." Cecily turned from the window. "It doesn't matter. Whether he married or not has nothing to do with me. People grieve and they do not remarry for all manner of reasons. It means nothing." "No," Mrs. Holt agreed. "It means nothing." Her tone suggested that she thought it meant a great deal. Cecily sat back down. She picked up her book. She did not read a single word of it for the rest of the evening. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark with the familiar sounds of the cottage around her, the wind off the moors, the occasional creak of the old beams, Mrs. Holt's slow footsteps overhead, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about Harriet Vane sitting in the village in a mile and a half away. She had imagined Harriet sometimes, had constructed her from almost nothing, the 6-year-old with the pigeon, the dark hair that matched their father's, the laugh that had carried across the park on that Tuesday afternoon that Cecily had not known would be one of the last ordinary afternoons of her life. She had wondered who Harriet had become, whether she was like their mother or their father or neither, whether she was happy, whether she had visited the grave. That thought had surfaced occasionally over the years, in the way of thoughts one does not invite. The grave, the stone with her name on it, some stranger walking past and reading Cecily Ann Vane, without knowing that Cecily Ann Vane was at that precise moment teaching arithmetic to a farmer's son in North Yorkshire, that she was very much alive and intermittently furious about it. She had never decided how she felt about the grave. It was too strange a thing to have straightforward feelings about. She turned onto her side. She thought, against her will, about Edmund. She did not let herself do this often. She had a system, the same system she had developed in the first terrible year, when not having a system had nearly broken her. She allowed herself the thought. She did not add to it. She did not build on it or follow it anywhere. She let it pass through like weather. Edmund, the way he had looked at her as though she was the most interesting thing in any room she entered. The poem he had read aloud, horribly, and then looked up at her with such earnest horror at his own performance that she had laughed until her sides hurt. The letter she had received 4 days before everything ended, which she had memorized, every word of it in those first long months in Yorkshire, and which she had then spent the next 16 years trying to forget. I intend to love you for a very long time, Miss Vane. I thought you should know. She closed her eyes. She thought, he does not know I exist. He has grieved and recovered and become someone I have never met. He is a duke with a life and a world that has nothing to do with me. She thought, I have built something here, small but mine. I have children who need teaching on Monday morning. She thought, I have been safe here. And underneath all of it, quiet and persistent as groundwater, he did not come. 17 years. If he had wanted to find her, if he had questioned anything, doubted anything, refused to simply accept what he was told, he could have looked. He was a duke. He had resources and connections and the particular kind of authority that opens doors that are closed to everyone else. He had not looked. He had believed what he was told and gone home and lived his life. She knew it was not fair, this feeling. She knew, she had known for years in the rational part of herself, that he had been given no reason to look, that he had been deceived as thoroughly as she had, that he was as much a victim of it as anyone. She knew all of that. She felt what she felt anyway. Harriet came at 10 in the morning. Cecily had decided, sometime in the small hours, that she would see her, not because she was ready, not because she had resolved anything, but because refusing felt, on balance, like a different kind of cowardice than going. She opened the door herself. They stood and looked at each other for a long moment, the dead sister and the living one, 17 years of absence between them like a third presence on the doorstep. Harriet had their father's dark hair and their mother's posture and eyes that Cecily did not recognize from anyone, which made sense, she supposed. People became their own things. She looked like she had been crying. She looked like she was very determined not to cry again. Cecily, she said. Her voice cracked slightly on the word and she pressed her lips together. Margaret, Cecily said. The correction was automatic, habitual, and she heard how it sounded the moment it left her mouth, a small cruelty, unintended, landing anyway. Harriet absorbed it without flinching. Cecily, she said again, gently, firmly, please, a long beat. Come in, Cecily said. They sat at the same small table where Cecily had once sat with Mrs. Holt and been told she was dead. There was something appropriate about that, in a grim sort of way. Harriet told her everything, the deathbed confession, the debts, the letter their father had held over the old Duke of Renmore, the arrangement. She told it plainly and in order, without embellishment, and Cecily listened with her hands around a cup of tea she did not drink, and her face doing what her face had learned to do over 17 years, keeping the inside on the inside. When Harriet finished, there was a silence. So it was not just Mama, Cecily said. No, his father too. Yes. They arranged it together. Cecily looked at the table. 2 men sat in a room and decided to erase me, and my mother agreed to it. And I have been living in a cottage in Yorkshire for 17 years because the old Duke of Renmore wanted a better match for his son. She heard her own voice as she said it, remarkably steady, the steadiness of something that has already broken and set and become a different shape than it started as. Edmund didn't know, Harriet said. He has never known. He believes you died of illness. I know. Cecily set down the cup. You said that. He mourned you, properly. He never, Harriet hesitated. Mrs. Holt told me he never married, Cecily said. I know that too. Then you know that he... I know what it might mean, Cecily said, with more sharpness than she intended. I also know that it has been 17 years, Harriet. Whatever he felt, whatever either of us felt, we were 22 and 19. We were barely more than children. People do not simply, she stopped. Time does not stop. We are not the same people. Harriet looked at her across the table with those unrecognizable eyes. You called me Harriet, she said softly. Cecily blinked. She had, without noticing. Something shifted in her chest, small and unexpected, like a key turning in a lock she had forgotten was there. I'm sorry, she said, and was not sure what she was apologizing for exactly or to whom. "Don't be," Harriet said, and then, very quietly, I brought flowers, every March, to the grave. I didn't know, I had no idea, but I wanted someone to remember. The silence that followed was a different kind than the ones before it. Cecily looked at her sister, this stranger who had her father's hair and unknown eyes, and had brought flowers to an empty grave every spring for 17 years, and felt something she had been successfully not feeling for a very long time begin to come loose from wherever she had secured it. "I don't know how to go back," she said. Her voice, finally, was not steady. "I don't know who I would be. I have been Margaret for so long that you would be yourself," Harriet said simply. "That's all, just yourself." She did not agree that day. She asked Harriet to give her a week. Harriet, who had more patience than Cecily would have expected, and more steel underneath the patience than she initially showed, agreed without argument and went back to the inn and waited. The week was the longest Cecily had spent in years. She taught her classes. She tended the garden, though there was little left to tend in November. She sat with Mrs. Holt in the evenings and did not talk about any of it, because Mrs. Holt already knew everything she was thinking and had the wisdom not to say so. On the 5th day, Dr. Graves came to call. He was 31, the village doctor, a decent and straightforward man who had arrived in Hawksmoor 4 years ago and had made no secret of the regard he had developed for Margaret Holt. He had asked her twice, politely, without pressure, with the genuine warmth of someone who has decided to want something and approached it honestly. She had said no both times. He sat across from her in the parlor with his hat in his hands and asked if she was all right. He had heard there was a visitor, a family matter, and she looked at him and thought, clearly and without cruelty, that he was a good man and she could not do it. She had never been able to do it. She knew why. She had known for 17 years and had spent 17 years constructing very convincing arguments about why the reason was irrelevant. After he left, she sat for a long time in the empty parlor. Then she went upstairs and began, very quietly, to pack a bag. Mrs. Holt was in the kitchen when Cecily came down. She looked at the bag in Cecily's hand. She said nothing. "Don't," Cecily said, though Mrs. Holt had not spoken. "Don't say anything wise. I cannot bear it today." Mrs. Holt turned back to what she was doing at the stove. "There is a letter," she said after a moment, "in the tin on the top shelf. I have been keeping it for some time. I think you should take it with you." Cecily looked at the shelf. At the old tin she had always assumed contained nothing but papers and receipts. What letter? "One the old Duke wrote," Mrs. Holt said, "to me, when this was all arranged, explaining certain things, setting out terms." A pause. "I kept it because I thought there might come a time when the truth needed something more solid than a woman's word to stand on." Cecily stared at her. "You have had a letter from Edmund's father," she said, "all this time, explaining what he did, and you kept it. Yes. Why didn't you tell me?" Mrs. Holt was quiet for a moment. When she turned, her expression had something in it that Cecily had not seen there before, not quite guilt, but close to it. The closest thing to it that a woman of her particular temperament was capable of showing. "Because for a long time," she said, "I was not sure you were going to leave, and the letter is not useful here. It is only useful there." Cecily held her gaze for a long moment. Then she reached up and took the tin from the shelf. She went to Harriet the next morning. Harriet opened the door of the inn room and looked at the bag in Cecily's hand and the tin under her arm, and something in her face, carefully controlled until now, careful and patient and determined, finally broke open into something much younger and much less composed. She did not say anything. She simply crossed the room and put her arms around her sister. Cecily stood very still for a moment. Then slowly, she put her arms around Harriet too. Outside, the November moors stretched gray and cold and enormous to every horizon. Inside, two sisters stood in a small warm room and held on, and 17 years of distance did not disappear. It could not, it was not that simple, it was never that simple, but it shifted just slightly into something that felt like it might eventually be crossed. "All right," Cecily said at last into her sister's shoulder. Her voice was muffled and entirely undignified. "All right, let's go." He should not have come. He had told himself this at every stage of the journey, in his study in London while Harriet Vane was still sitting across from him, in the hours after she left while he stood at his library window and stared at nothing, in the morning when he cancelled 3 appointments and told Simmons to have the carriage ready by noon. He had told himself he was being irrational, that the correct course of action was to wait, to verify, to approach this as he approached everything, with patience and method and the systematic elimination of uncertainty before any action was taken. He had been 2 days north of London before he admitted that he was not capable of waiting. Not for this. Harriet had sent word ahead, he had asked her to, and she had agreed, though something in her expression when she agreed suggested she was not entirely certain it was the right decision. He understood her hesitation. He did not know what Cecily had been told, or what she felt, or what 17 years had made of the girl he had known. He did not know what he was riding toward. He knew only that she was alive. That single fact had rearranged everything in him, silently and completely, the way an earthquake rearranges a landscape, not destroying it precisely, but making it unrecognizable. All the furniture of the last 17 years, so carefully placed, so precisely maintained, had shifted in the night and he could not find his footing in any of it. She was alive. She had been alive the whole time. He had stood at her grave in the November frost 4 days ago and read her name on the stone he had paid for, and she had been alive. He did not allow himself to think about his father. Not yet. That was a room he would have to enter eventually, but not while he was moving. Not while the carriage wheels were still turning and there was still distance between him and her. He needed to be still for that. He needed to be somewhere he could put his hands on something solid before he opened that particular door. He looked out at the moors instead. He had never been this far north. The landscape was nothing like anything he knew, vast and austere and indifferent to observation, the winter grass pale as straw, the sky the particular gray of pewter left too long without polishing. It should have been bleak. It was, in some technical sense, entirely bleak. He found he could not stop looking at it. She had lived here for 17 years. She had looked at this sky every morning. These hills had been the edges of her world. He tried to understand that and found he could not, quite. His mind kept sliding off it, the way it slides off things that are too large to be taken in whole. He found the inn at Hawksmoor as the light was going. Harriet met him in the narrow front room, and he saw immediately from her face that something had already happened, something that required him to recalibrate whatever he had been preparing himself for. "She knows you're coming," Harriet said. "I told her yesterday." And a pause. She didn't say much. That could mean several things. Yes, Harriet agreed. It could. He sat down. He accepted the tea that was brought without tasting it. Outside the single window the last light was draining from the moors, and the darkness coming in was absolute in the way that darkness in cities never quite managed. "How is she?" he asked. The question felt inadequate before he finished asking it. Harriet considered it seriously, which he appreciated. "She is herself," she said at last, "very much herself, more than I expected, perhaps. She looked for the word. She has not been waiting, if that's what you're wondering. She has been living." Edmund absorbed this. "Good," he said. He meant it. He was almost sure he meant it. "She is not," Harriet stopped. Started again, more carefully. "Edmund. She is not the girl you knew. She is 36 years old and she has been through something that would have broken most people, and she is angry. Not at this moment, not on the surface, but underneath. She is very angry and she has been managing it for a very long time, and I think you should know that before you see her. Who is she angry at?" Harriet looked at him steadily. "Everyone, I think, my mother, your father, the general shape of what was done to her." A pause, and you, a little, unfairly. "She knows it's unfair, which I think makes it worse." "Why me?" "Because you believed it," Harriet said simply. "She knows you had no reason not to. She knows it completely in her head. But 17 years is a long time to be dead to the person you—" She stopped. The fire crackled. "To the person you loved," Edmund said quietly. Harriet did not answer, which was, again, an answer. He did not go to the cottage that evening. He had intended to. He had ridden 300 miles on the strength of that intention. But sitting in the inn with the moors dark outside and Harriet's words rearranging themselves in his chest, he found he could not simply arrive at her door in the dark after 17 years as though he were calling on a neighbor. He needed one night. He sat by the fire until late, and he let himself think about his father. He had been avoiding it since Monday, had packed it away with the brisk efficiency of a man who has had 20 years of practice at not thinking about the things that are most urgent to think about. But it would not stay packed any longer, and the inn at Hawksmoor in the dark was as good a place as any to unpack it. His father had done this. His father had sat in a room with a frightened man and made a calculation, weighed Edmund's grief against his own interests, and found Edmund's grief to be the lighter thing. Had arranged, with the precision of a man accustomed to arranging things, for a girl of 19 to be removed from her life, and for his son to be left with a stone in a churchyard and 17 years of absence where she should have been. Edmund sat with this for a long time. He had admired his father, had spent years attempting to become a version of him, the competence, the authority, the complete assurance. He had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that his father's judgment could be trusted, that behind the decisions he had not always understood, there was a sound and private reason. He understood now what the private reason had been. He thought about the grave, about the stone he had paid for, about standing there 4 days ago in the frost reading her name, not knowing. He picked up his glass, set it down without drinking. He thought, "I will be very, very angry about this." Later, when she is, he could not finish the thought. He went to bed. He did not sleep. He went to the cottage in the morning. It was a clear day, cold and still, the frost heavy on the grass and the moors pale gold in the early light. He walked. The inn was not far, and he needed the air, and if he was honest with himself, he needed the time. Each step a small negotiation with the next one. The cottage was at the end of a lane set back from the road, with a low stone wall and a winter garden that showed, even in its November dormancy, the evidence of patient and attentive care. Neat beds, a climbing rose cut back for the season, a small apple tree bare and precise against the gray sky. She had tended this. Her hands had shaped this. He stood at the gate for longer than was strictly dignified. Then he opened it and walked to the door and knocked. Nothing happened for long enough that he began to wonder if she had changed her mind. If she was standing on the other side of the door deciding, he would not have blamed her. He was standing on this side of the door deciding, and he had chosen to come here of his own accord. Then the door opened. He had tried to prepare himself. He had spent 3 days and 300 miles preparing himself. He had constructed, carefully and methodically, a version of this moment that he thought he could survive. He had not, it turned out, constructed it correctly. She was not the girl he had known. Harriet had told him that, and he had believed it intellectually, the way one believes things one has not yet felt. But here, now, she was 36 and there were lines at the corners of her eyes, and her dark hair was pinned up simply, practically, the way of a woman who does not dress for being looked at. She was wearing a plain gray dress, and she had ink on her right hand from her morning's work, and she was looking at him with an expression he could not read at all, which was new, because he had always been able to read her. She was also, and he had not expected this, he did not know why he had not expected this, exactly herself. Underneath everything that was different, underneath the years and the distance and the strangeness of the moment, there was something completely and unmistakably Cecily about her that hit him somewhere below the ribs and did not let go. He opened his mouth. She said, "You had better come in." And she turned and walked back into the cottage, leaving him to follow or not, which seemed to him entirely characteristic. He followed. The inside of the cottage was small and clean and warm. Books everywhere stacked on the table, arranged on a shelf that took up most of one wall, 2 left open on the windowsill as though she had been moving between them. A fire going well. The remains of breakfast on the table, cleared but not yet entirely removed. He had imagined, he realized now, standing in her doorway, something different, something smaller somehow, more provisional, a life held in suspension, waiting. This was not that. This was a life, full and actual and entirely her own. She stood by the fireplace with her arms at her sides and looked at him. He stood by the door and looked at her. The silence between them had texture to it, 17 years of texture, everything unsaid pressing up against the surface from both sides at once. He said, "Cecily," her jaw tightened. "I go by Margaret here," she said, quietly, without heat. "I know I'm sorry." He paused. May I call you Cecily? Just no." The word was simple, not angry, just decided. He absorbed it. "All right." Another silence. "You look well," he said, which was both true and entirely inadequate, and he knew it the moment it left his mouth. Something moved in her expression, the ghost of something that might, under different circumstances, have been a smile. "You look older," she said. "Yes. That tends to happen. Over 17 years, yes." A pause, the almost smile gone. "It does." He stayed. He had not entirely planned this, had not allowed himself to plan past the moment of arriving, because planning past it had felt presumptuous in ways he could not articulate. But she did not ask him to leave, and so he stayed, and they sat on opposite sides of the small room with the fire between them and talked. Not about any of the things that mattered most. Not yet. They talked about his journey north, about the village, about the school where she taught. She described her students with a precision and warmth that made him understand what 11 years of teaching had made of her in ways he could not have predicted. He listened. He asked questions. She answered them and occasionally asked one in return, and he understood that she was doing what he was doing, establishing that they were both still capable of ordinary conversation before attempting anything else. It was the most careful thing he had ever participated in. It was also, underneath the care, like finding something he had given up looking for. He did not say that. He was not yet entitled to say that. He came back the next day, and the day after. She did not invite him and she did not turn him away, which he took as provisional permission and treated accordingly. He kept his visits to the mornings, when Mrs. Holt was present, sharp-eyed and observant, watching him with an expression he found difficult to interpret and eventually understood to be guilt. He brought nothing. He asked for nothing. He sat in the chair she directed him to and drank the tea that was offered and left when the conversation ran out. On the third day she said, without looking up from the book she was pretending to read, "You don't have to keep coming, you know. There is nothing that requires your continued presence here." "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Because I am not ready to leave yet." She looked up. He met her eyes and did not look away. "That is not," she stopped. "That is not a sufficient reason. I know that too." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her deciding something, could see the decision moving behind her eyes, that particular interior motion he had recognized in her at 22 and apparently had not forgotten. "It has been 17 years, Edmund," she said. His name in her mouth, the first time she had used it, landed like something physical. We cannot simply," "I know," he said, for the third time and meant it differently each time. "You don't know what She stopped again. "Tell me," he said. "Whatever it is, tell me." She closed the book. She set it down. She folded her hands in her lap with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing, consciously, to stop doing the thing they have been doing for a very long time. "You believed it," she said, very quietly. "You stood at a grave with my name on it and you believed it and you went home." He did not defend himself. There was no defense. "Yes. I know you had no reason not to." Her voice was steady and controlled and just barely at the edges, not. "I know that completely. I have known it for 17 years. It does not," she pressed her lips together. "It does not entirely help." "No," he said. "I don't imagine it does." "I waited," she said, and there it was, the thing underneath everything, arriving finally at the surface. "I know that is irrational. I know there was nothing to wait for. But in the beginning, in those first months, I kept thinking that you would, that somehow." She stopped. The fire crackled. "I am sorry," Edmund said. The words were entirely insufficient, and he knew it and said them anyway because they were true. "I am so sorry, Cecily. I am sorry for all of it." "Margaret," she said very quietly. He looked at her. Her eyes were bright. Not quite, but almost. "All right," he said just as quietly. "Margaret." On the 5th day, the letter arrived from London. Edmund had been expecting something of this sort. He had cancelled appointments and disappeared north without adequate explanation, and the machinery of his life in London, social, legal, familial, did not tolerate absence without generating correspondence. He read it in his room at the inn that evening. It was from his mother. 2 pages, closely written, in the precise hand of a woman who had been composing careful letters her entire adult life. She had heard, through what channel she did not specify, though Edmund could guess, that he had gone north suddenly on a personal matter. She wrote with the particular combination of affection and pressure she had perfected over 40 years. The Pembertons were asking questions. The proposed arrangement could not be left unaddressed indefinitely. The family name required, she used that word, required, that he return to London and attend to his obligations. "You have mourned long enough," she wrote near the end. "Whatever has taken you north, Edmund, I trust you will handle it sensibly." He set the letter down. He sat for a long time in the small inn-room with the moors dark outside and his mother's letter on the table, and thought about what sensibly meant, and whether he had ever in his life been capable of it where Cecily Vane was concerned. He rather thought the answer was no. He rather thought, sitting there in the dark, that he did not intend to start now. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Cecily was at the school when Harriet brought it. She found it on the table when she came home at midday, propped against the tea tin, Harriet sitting across from it with the expression of someone who has been managing a piece of information for several hours and is relieved to hand it over. "It came this morning," Harriet said, "from Mrs. Holt." Cecily looked at the letter, then at Harriet. "Mrs. Holt is in the next room." She wrote it anyway. She said she preferred to say it in writing. Harriet paused. I think she was not sure she could say it aloud. Cecily sat down. She looked at the letter for a moment, at the old woman's careful, cramped handwriting on the outside, her name, the name she had been given and had carried for 17 years, and then she opened it. It was short, less than a page. Mrs. Holt was not a woman who used more words than the thing required. "There are things I should have told you long ago. I did not, for reasons that seemed sufficient at the time and do not seem sufficient now. I am 73 years old, and I find I am no longer willing to carry what I have been carrying. The letter in the tin is only part of it. The rest is in what I have to say to you and to Lord Ashford together. I am asking you to arrange this. I am asking you to forgive me, though I understand if you cannot. I remain, as I have always been, yours, E. Holt." Cecily read it twice. Then she folded it and set it down and looked at the window, at the pale December sky, the frost still heavy on the stone wall outside, the bare branches of the apple tree perfectly still in the cold air. "What do you think she means?" Harriet asked. "The rest of it?" "I don't know," Cecily said, but she thought she might. She sent word to Edmund that afternoon. She wrote the note herself, sitting at the table where she marked her students' work, using the same pen and the same plain paper. She wrote 3 drafts. The first 2 were longer than they needed to be. The third was 4 sentences. "There is something Mrs. Holt needs to tell us. Both of us together. Will you come tomorrow morning?" See, she looked at the initial for a moment. Then she sealed it and gave it to Harriet without changing it. He came at 9. She heard the knock and opened the door herself, and he was standing on the path in his dark coat with the frost still white on the grass behind him, and she had been seeing him every morning for a week, and it still did something to her composure that she wished it would stop doing. "Good morning," he said. "Come in," she said. "Mrs. Holt is waiting." He followed her through to the small sitting room where Mrs. Holt was already in her chair by the fire, very upright, very still, her hands folded in her lap in the manner of someone who has made a decision and intends to see it through before they lose their nerve. She looked at Edmund when he came in. Something passed across her face, a complicated thing, made of recognition and grief and the particular pain of seeing someone you have known since childhood and understanding fully what you did to them. "My lord," she said, "Mrs. Holt." Edmund looked at her for a moment. Then quietly, "You taught me to walk." "Yes," she said, "I did. I have been trying to decide," he said, sitting down across from her, "whether that makes this better or worse." "Worse, I should think," Mrs. Holt said, with the ghost of her usual directness. "Sit down, my lord. There is a great deal to say, and I am not as young as I was." She began, as she did everything, without preamble. She had worked for the Ashford family for 11 years. She had loved the child. Edmund had been a serious boy, not easy but worth the effort, the kind of child who asked genuine questions and listened to the answers. When she left their employ, it had been on good terms, or so she had believed. She had retired to her sister's cottage in Yorkshire. She had expected to live out her days quietly. Then the old Duke had come to see her. He came himself, Cecily said. He came himself. Mrs. Holt's hands tightened slightly in her lap. In the autumn of 1805. He told me what he needed. A woman he could trust in a location sufficiently removed from London with sufficient motivation to be discreet. A pause. He offered money, a good deal of it, enough to buy this cottage and keep it for life. "And you agreed," Edmund said. His voice was even. Cecily glanced at him. His face was composed, careful, the particular blankness of someone keeping something very large very still. "Not immediately." Mrs. Holt met his eyes. "I argued with him. I told him it was wrong. He told me." She stopped, took a breath. "He told me the alternative was worse. That if the attachment continued, if you married the girl, her family's situation would destroy you. The debts, the scandal attached to her father, he said it would be used against you. That your enemies in Parliament would use it. That it would cost you everything he had built." "He was lying," Edmund said. "I know that now." A pause. "I believed him then." Or she stopped again. "I wanted to believe him. That is not the same thing, and I have known the difference for 17 years. The fire shifted. Outside, a wind moved across the moors in that long low way it had, and the cottage held against it. "There is more," Mrs. Holt said. "Tell us," Cecily said. She told them about the first year. Cecily knew parts of it, her own experience of it, the fever and the waking and the slow, terrible understanding of where she was and why. But she had not known all of it from Mrs. Holt's side. Had not known that the old woman had written to the Duke 4 times in those first months, each letter more urgent than the last, reporting that the girl was not adjusting, that she was losing weight, that she had stopped speaking for 3 weeks in the spring. 3 weeks, Cecily said, almost to herself. She remembered that. She had not known anyone had noticed enough to report it. His response to each letter was the same, Mrs. Holt said, that I was to manage it, that the arrangement was settled. Her voice was flat now, drained. In his 4th reply he reminded me what I had been paid for. Edmund made a sound, not quite a word. Cecily glanced at him again. His jaw was set, and his hands were still on his knees, and there was something in his eyes that she recognized as anger in the particular form it takes when it has nowhere yet to go. There was something else in that last letter, Mrs. Holt said, something I did not understand at the time. She looked at Edmund. He wrote that you had become difficult, that you were refusing to consider other attachments, that you had told him you would not discuss it. Edmund said nothing. He wrote that he was concerned, Mrs. Holt said carefully, that the grief was becoming inconvenient. That was his word, inconvenient. The silence that followed this had a particular quality to it. He called my grief inconvenient, Edmund said, very quietly. Yes, while he was the cause of it. Yes. Edmund stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, and Cecily watched his shoulders and thought about inconvenient and about a man who had calculated his son's pain into an arrangement and found it a manageable variable. "There is one more thing," Mrs. Holt said. Cecily looked at her. "Mrs. Holt." "I know." The old woman's voice for the first time was unsteady. "I know, but you must hear it." She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a folded paper, old, the folds soft with age, the paper slightly yellowed. "This is not the letter from the tin." This is a different one he sent with the money at the beginning. I have kept it because she paused. I kept it because I could not decide what to do with it, and then too much time passed, and I still could not decide. And then you were leaving, and I thought the letter in the tin was enough. And this one, give it to me, Cecily said. Mrs. Holt held it out. Cecily took it. She unfolded it slowly. The paper was fragile at the creases, and read it. It was short, half a page. The handwriting was large and assured, the handwriting of a man who did not second-guess himself. She read it once. Then she held it out to Edmund. He turned from the window, looked at her face first, then took the letter. She watched him read it. She had become, over 17 years, very practiced at reading faces. It was useful when you spent your days with children who had not yet learned to hide things. Edmund had learned very well, but there were limits to what even the best composure could hold, and she watched those limits reach themselves, one by one, as his eyes moved down the page. The letter said several things. It said that the arrangement was to be permanent, not temporary, as Mrs. Holt had apparently been led to believe initially, permanent. The girl was never to return to London. She was never to contact Edmund. If she attempted to do so, the protections currently extended to her father would be withdrawn. It said that Edmund was to be kept in grief long enough to become manageable. That was the phrase, long enough to become manageable, after which he would accept a suitable match and the matter would be closed. And at the end, in the same large, assured hand, almost as an afterthought, "My son is a good man, better than I deserve, perhaps. See that the girl is comfortable. This was never about her." Edmund lowered the letter. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he set it on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone who does not trust what their hands might do otherwise. "May I have a moment?" he said, outside. It was not quite a question. "Of course," Cecily said. He went out. The door closed quietly behind him. Mrs. Holt and Cecily sat in silence. After a moment, Mrs. Holt said, "I am sorry for all of it. I know that is insufficient." "It is," Cecily said. Then, after a pause, "But I believe you." The old woman closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were wet, which Cecily had never seen before and found more affecting than she expected. "He was a good boy," Mrs. Holt said. "Edmund. He always was." A pause. "I told myself that what I did protected him. I told myself that for a long time. Did you believe it?" A silence. "No," Mrs. Holt said. "Not really. Not after the first year." Cecily looked at the letter on the table, at the old Duke's handwriting, at the phrase "long enough to become manageable." She thought about Edmund at 22, standing at a grave in the March sunshine. She thought about 17 years of closed rooms and careful distances, and a life fully furnished but never quite inhabited. She thought about the letter he had written her 4 days before everything ended, which she still knew by heart, which she had spent 16 years trying to forget and never managed. "I intend to love you for a very long time, Miss Vane." She pressed her hand flat against the table. "All right," she said, to no one in particular. She got up and went outside. He was standing at the low stone wall at the edge of the garden, looking out at the moors. The December light was flat and pale, the frost still holding in the shadows of the stone. He did not turn when she came out, but she saw his shoulders register that she was there. She stood beside him at the wall. They looked at the moors together for a while. "Better than I deserve," Edmund said at last, quoting. His voice was very quiet. "He wrote that." "Yes." "And then went home and lived another 22 years and said nothing." "Yes." He was silent for a moment. "I keep thinking, I keep trying to find a way to understand it. Some explanation that makes it not acceptable but comprehensible. Some version of it where he believed he was acting rightly. And I cannot find one." He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her. He knew what it cost, and he decided it was an acceptable cost. That is all there is. Cecily looked at the moors, the pale grass, the dark line of hills in the distance. "My mother knew too," she said. "She lived with it for 17 years. She sent me flowers at Christmas the first 3 years. Did Mrs. Holt tell you that?" "Anonymous." No note, just flowers. I didn't know who sent them until today. God, Edmund said. Yes, Cecily considered this. I think she was trying to, I don't know what she was trying to do, apologize without apologizing, be present without being seen. She paused. It didn't help. But I think she knew that. The wind came across the moors, cold and clean and smelling of nothing but itself. I am angry, Edmund said. I want you to know that I am very angry. At my father, at your mother, at Barlow, who I now suspect knew more than he stopped. But I am also aware that anger is not what matters most at this precise moment. Cecily looked at him. What matters most, he said at this precise moment, is that I would like to tell you something and I need you to let me finish before you, Edmund, please. She closed her mouth. He turned to face her fully. The winter light was not kind to either of them. It showed everything, the years, the lines, the evidence of time. And she thought that she had never seen him look more himself than he did right now, with the careful composure entirely gone and just the actual man underneath it. I have been, he said, for 17 years a person who did not want things. I told myself it was enough. I told myself I had what I needed and that the rest was sentimentality, weakness. I told myself that for so long that I nearly believed it. He paused. I did not believe it. I want you to know that. I did not believe it for a single day. Cecily held very still. I do not know what you want, he said. I do not know what 17 years has made of what you felt, or whether there is anything left of it, or whether the way it ended has put it beyond any possibility of I don't know. I don't know any of it. I am not asking you to tell me now. Another pause. I am only telling you that I have not, that for me it has not. He stopped. Looked at her. I have never stopped, he said. That is all. Whatever else is true, I have never stopped. The moors were very quiet. Cecily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the system she had built, the discipline, the content life, the good enough life, the life she had decided to want because it was the one available to her. She thought about Dr. Graves and his honest warmth and her honest inability to want it. She thought about the pianoforte with the missing key that she loved disproportionately, and the children on Monday morning, and the ceiling with the cracks shaped like a river. She thought about standing at this very wall 6 days ago telling herself she was content. She thought about what content actually meant and what she had been using it to replace. I know, she said, 2 words, very quiet. Edmund looked at her. I know, she said again, I never stopped either. I want you to know that I am furious about it. I have been furious about it for years. It was extremely inconvenient. Something happened in his face. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated than a smile and more real. Yes, he said. I imagine it was. They stood at the wall for a while longer. They did not touch. They were not yet at touching. There was too much still between them, too much to say, too many things to be settled before any of that. They both understood this without discussing it. But they stood there together in the December cold and looked at the moors, and that was something. That was, in fact, quite a lot. The trouble arrived from London on Thursday. A letter from Lord Pemberton himself this time. Not his mother, not a solicitor, Pemberton directly, which told Edmund something about how seriously the family was taking the situation. He read it in his room at the inn with Harriet sitting across from him, having decided some days ago that Harriet's counsel was something he valued and intended to use. The letter was not precisely a threat. It was the kind of letter that surrounds a threat very closely without quite becoming one, expressions of confusion at Edmund's continued absence, references to the understanding that had been reached between the families, a careful mention of how unfortunate it would be if the matter became a subject of wider discussion. They will talk, Harriet said, when she had read it. Yes. If they discover Cecily is alive, and they will eventually, these things cannot be contained. They will say she entrapped you, that she manufactured her own death to trap a duke. They will make it as ugly as they can, I know, and Cecily has no legal identity. She is still, on paper, dead. Which means, I know, Edmund said again, I have been thinking about nothing else for 2 days. Harriet looked at him. What do you intend to do? Edmund set the letter down. He had spent 2 days with this problem, turning it over, examining it, looking for the straightforward path through it. There was no straightforward path. There was only the path that was right, which was going to be neither easy nor quiet nor free of consequence. He found, sitting there in the small inn-room with the Moors outside and Harriet Vane watching him with her unreadable eyes, that he did not care about any of that. "I intend," he said, "to go back to London." Harriet's expression shifted. "With Cecily." "That is her decision." He paused. "But I intend to make certain she understands what I am going back to do." "And what is that?" Edmund looked at the letter from Pemberton, at the careful, surrounding language, at the threat dressed in the clothing of concern. "I am going to make it very difficult," he said quietly, "for anyone to say anything about Cecily Vane except the truth." He went to the cottage that evening. Cecily was alone. Mrs. Holt had retired early. Harriet was at the inn, and she opened the door and looked at his face and said, "Come in. Something has happened. A letter from Pemberton. Sit down. Tell me." He told her, all of it, the letter, Harriet's assessment, the shape of what was coming. He told her plainly and completely, the way he had learned in 6 days of careful conversation that she preferred things to be told. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "They will be unpleasant," she said, "very likely. I have been unpleasant things before." She looked at the fire, dead, for instance. "That was quite unpleasant." He looked at her. "That was almost a joke," he said. "Yes, well," she pressed her lips together. "I am working up to it." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved across the moors. "Edmund," she said, "what exactly are you proposing to do in London?" "Whatever is necessary," he said, "to restore your name, your legal existence, and after that." He looked at her steadily. "I told you, I'm not asking you for anything now. I'm not asking you to decide anything. I'm telling you what I intend to do regardless of what you decide." She looked back at him. "You are the most stubborn man," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "You knew that at 19. "I did," she said. "I found it very irritating." And now, a pause, long enough that he felt it. "Still irritating," she said. "Somewhat less so." That night after he had gone, Cecily sat alone by the fire. She thought about London, about walking back into a world that had buried her, with a name she would have to reclaim, and a story she would have to tell, and 100 rooms full of people who would look at her with the specific appetite of those who enjoy other people's catastrophes. She thought about what it would cost. She thought about what staying would cost. She reached for the letter from the tin, the old Duke's letter, the one with the legal weight Mrs. Holt had preserved, and she read it one more time. Not for the information. She had the information. She read it because she needed to feel the full dimension of what had been done to her before she decided what to do with it. She read it. She folded it. She held it in her hands for a moment. Then she set it on the table, went to her writing desk, and began methodically, deliberately, with the focused calm of a woman who has been underestimated for 17 years and has decided she is finished with it, to make a list. Everything she would need. Everything she would have to do. Everything she intended to say in London, in public, in the full hearing of everyone who had been told she was dead. She wrote until the fire burned low. Then she went to bed and slept, for the first time in weeks, without waking. She had forgotten how loud it was. That was the first thing, not the size of it, not the smell of coal smoke and river, and 10,000 lives being lived in close proximity, but the noise. The constant, layered, indifferent noise of a city that did not know or care that Cecily Ann Vane had just ridden back into it after 17 years of being dead. She sat in the carriage with Harriet beside her and watched London reassemble itself outside the window. The familiar streets becoming unfamiliar and then familiar again, in the disorienting way of places one has known in a different life. And she kept her hands folded in her lap, and her face composed and thought about her list. She had written 4 pages. She had reviewed them every evening for the 2 weeks of preparation before they left Yorkshire. She knew what needed to be done, and in what order, and she had decided that the only way through it was directly, which was the only way she had ever known how to do anything that mattered. Edmund was in a separate carriage. This had been her decision, arriving together before anything was established, would hand the gossips precisely the narrative they were looking for. They had agreed on it practically, in the manner they had developed over the last weeks for discussing practical things, which was efficiently and without excessive feeling, because the feeling was there in abundance and needed to be managed carefully or it would get in the way of the work. There was a great deal of work to do first. She intended to do it. Edmund had arranged a house for her and Harriet in a quiet street in Mayfair, not his own, not adjacent to his own, a property belonging to a friend who was wintering abroad and had been persuaded to make it available. It was clean and well-staffed and entirely respectable, which was what was needed. Cecily walked through it on the first afternoon with the methodical attention she brought to new spaces and decided it would do. Harriet watched her from the doorway of the upstairs sitting room. "You're not frightened at all, are you?" she said. "Not quite a question." "I'm terrified," Cecily said, examining the writing desk by the window. "I've simply decided it's irrelevant." Harriet was quiet for a moment. "Mama would have said that was stubbornness." "Mama," Cecily said without looking up, "would have been right. The first meeting was with Barlow." Edmund had requested it, formally, in writing, with the specific language of a man who has decided to be very deliberate about everything he does for the foreseeable future. Barlow was 67, the third generation of his family to serve the Ashford dukedom, and he arrived at Renmore House on a gray January morning with the expression of a man who has suspected for some time that a reckoning was approaching and has not managed to adequately prepare for it. Cecily was already there when he arrived. Edmund had told her she did not have to be present. She had looked at him with an expression that made it clear she had not asked his opinion on the matter. She sat in the chair to Edmund's left at the head of the table with the two letters in front of her, the one from the tin and the one Mrs. Holt had kept separately, and she watched Barlow's face when he saw her. Watched the sequence of it, confusion, recognition, something he tried to suppress and did not entirely manage. "Mr. Barlow," Edmund said, "I believe you recognize Miss Vane." Barlow stopped, looked at Edmund, looked at Cecily, looked at the letters on the table with the particular attention of a man who knows what they contain. "Your Grace, I must explain, you must," Edmund agreed. "Please do." He had known. Not at the beginning, not in 1806, when the arrangement was made, but by 1812 at the latest, when the old Duke had included him in the management of certain financial instruments related to a cottage in Yorkshire. Barlow had known what he was managing and for whom and why. He had said nothing. He said this with the defensive precision of a man trying to find the smallest possible version of his own guilt. He had not been asked to participate. He had simply not spoken. He had maintained the discretion his position required. He had considered it not his place. Cecily listened to all of this without speaking. When Barlow finished, she said, "You watched him grieve." Barlow blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Lord Ashford. For 6 years you sat across from him in this house and managed his affairs and watched him grieve, and you knew, and you said nothing." She paused. "I'm not asking you to explain it again. I understand what you have said. I'm simply making sure you understand what it means." Barlow was silent. "Good," Cecily said. "Now, here is what is going to happen." Barlow was going to assist in the legal restoration of Cecily Ann Vane. He was going to do this thoroughly, efficiently, and without any version of the events becoming publicly associated with his firm's prior knowledge. He was going to use every connection and resource at his disposal to ensure that the death certificate was invalidated with the minimum of procedural drama and the maximum of legal solidity. He was going to do all of this because it was right, and also because Edmund had made it quietly and completely clear that the alternative was the termination of a relationship that had existed for 3 generations of Ashfords and Barlows, and the full disclosure of exactly what Barlow had known and when. He agreed to all of it. When he left, Edmund looked at Cecily. "You were rather magnificent," he said. "I was precise," she said. "There is a difference, not in this case." She looked at him. The ghost of something moved across her face, not quite the smile, but closer than she usually allowed it. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything. You were about to." "I wasn't. A pause. I was thinking it very loudly. She stood up and gathered the letters from the table. "We have 3 more meetings this afternoon," she said. "Try to concentrate." The Pemberton situation resolved itself with less drama than anticipated and more than was comfortable. Lord Pemberton, faced with Edmund's direct and private communication, which detailed the circumstances of Cecily's disappearance, the involvement of the late Duke of Renmore, and the documentary evidence currently in the possession of his solicitor, made the calculation that men like Pemberton generally make when the ledger shifts against them. The proposed arrangement was quietly set aside. There were no public statements. The daughter was apparently relieved, which Edmund found both reassuring and mildly guilt-inducing. His mother was a different matter. She came to Renmore House on a Wednesday, unannounced, in the manner of a woman who has never found announcements necessary when entering her son's home. Edmund was in his study. He heard her in the hall and was already standing when she came through the door. She was 71. She had been a formidable woman her entire life and showed no signs of reconsidering this approach. She looked at Edmund with the expression she had perfected over 40 years, love and exasperation in precise and immovable combination, and then she sat down without being invited and said, "Tell me." He told her, all of it. He had not intended to tell her all of it, had planned a careful, abbreviated version that covered the essential facts without the full weight of his father's involvement. But she was his mother, and she was looking at him with the particular attention of someone who will know immediately if they are being given the abbreviated version, and he found he did not have the energy for it. He told her everything. When he finished, she sat quietly for a long moment. "Your father," she said at last. "Yes." "He told me she died of illness." Her voice was even. "I believed him. I had no reason not to believe him, I know." "Did he?" She stopped. "Was there anything in those letters about whether he discussed it with me? Whether I—" "Nothing," Edmund said. "You are not mentioned. I believe he kept it entirely from you." She absorbed this. The line of her shoulders changed slightly, not relief exactly, but the release of something she had been holding. "I see. Mama, I am thinking," she said with some of her usual sharpness. "Give me a moment." He gave her a moment. "Where is she?" she said finally. "Mayfair, with her sister. I would like to call on her." Edmund looked at her carefully. "She may not wish." "Then she may say so." His mother stood up with the decisiveness of a woman who has processed something significant and moved directly to what comes next. "She has every reason to receive me coldly. I will accept whatever she gives me." A pause. "But I am not going to pretend, Edmund, that a woman my son has loved for 20 years does not exist. I have already done that for 17. I find I have no appetite for more of it." Edmund looked at his mother. He thought, not for the first time, that she was considerably more remarkable than he usually remembered to give her credit for. "I'll send word ahead," he said. The call was not easy. Cecily received the Dowager Duchess of Renmore in Harriet's small sitting room on a Thursday afternoon, with Harriet present and tea that nobody drank, and a silence that had to be navigated rather than simply endured. Edmund's mother did not pretend. She did not offer excessive apologies or perform regret. She said that she had not known, that she was sorry for the years, that she understood if Cecily could not look at her without seeing the family that had done this, and that she would not impose herself if that was the case. Cecily listened to all of it and then said, "Did you know your husband was capable of this?" The question was direct enough that Harriet made a small sound. Edmund's mother did not flinch. "I knew he was capable of a great many things I preferred not to examine," she said. "I chose not to examine them. That is its own kind of fault." Cecily looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "it is." Another silence. "My son," the Dowager said carefully, "is better than his father was. He has always been better. I take no credit for that. It is simply what he is." She paused. "I thought you should know that I know it." Cecily said nothing. After the Dowager left, Harriet turned to her with raised eyebrows. "Well," Harriet said. "Don't," Cecily said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were thinking it very loudly." Harriet blinked. Then a smile broke across her face, sudden, genuine, entirely uncontrolled. "You sound exactly like him." Cecily looked at her. "Shut up," she said, and then, despite everything, despite 17 years and lawyers and the Dowager Duchess and everything still to be done, she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed properly since Yorkshire. It felt like something coming back. The evening that everything nearly fell apart arrived, as disasters generally do, without warning. It was a Thursday, 3 weeks into January. Edmund had been at a dinner at his club, unavoidable, the kind of social obligation that could not be declined without generating precisely the sort of speculation they were trying to manage. He came home at 10 to find Harriet's note already on his desk. "Come immediately. Bring whatever authority you have." H. Barlow had talked. Not everything, not to the public, not yet, but enough. A clerk in his office, a younger man with connections to a journalist who supplied the more fashionable periodicals with their social intelligence, had apparently been more observant than Barlow had realized, and considerably less discreet than was safe. The story that was circulating, in the specific underground current that flows through London society several hours before it reaches the surface, was not accurate. It was worse than inaccurate. It was the version that Harriet had warned about. A woman, previously unknown, making claims on the Duke of Renmore, a mysterious past, questions of identity and motive and inheritance. Edmund read the note. He read the intelligence Harriet had gathered in 3 hours of very focused effort through channels Cecily had not known her sister possessed. He set everything down. Cecily was sitting across from him at the table, very still, her hands flat on the surface. "How bad?" she said. "Manageable," Edmund said. "If we move tonight." "What does tonight mean?" He looked at her. "It means we do not wait for the story to set. We do not give it time to become the version people believe." He paused. "Lord and Lady Sefton are hosting this evening. Half of London is there. If we arrive together publicly, with the truth stated plainly, we take the story away from anyone who intends to tell a worse one." Cecily looked at him steadily. "You are proposing to walk into a room full of people who think I am dead." "Yes, tonight, within the hour ideally." She was quiet for a moment. He watched her watch the thing he had been watching for weeks, the particular quality of her stillness when she was deciding something. Not hesitation. Assessment. "All right," she said. She stood up. "Give me 20 minutes. She was ready in 18. She came downstairs in dark blue, not mourning, not white, nothing that could be read as either supplication or performance. She had dressed simply and well, with the assurance of a woman who understands that the point is not to be looked at but to be impossible to look away from, which is a different thing entirely. Edmund was waiting in the hall. He looked at her and said nothing for a moment. "Well," Cecily said. "Are we going?" "Yes," he said. "In a moment." "Edmund, you look," he said, "exactly as you should." She held his gaze. "As I should, or as you both," he said. "Come on." They arrived at the Sefton house at 10:30. The timing was deliberate, late enough that the room was full, early enough that the evening had not yet begun its slow dissolution. Edmund handed Cecily out of the carriage with the formal correctness of a man who understands that every gesture in the next hour will be observed and interpreted and discussed for weeks. And Cecily took his hand and stepped down and looked at the lit windows of the house with the expression of a woman who has made her list and is moving through it item by item. They were announced at the door. "Miss Cecily Ann Vane," the footman said, "and the Duke of Renmore." The room did not go silent. It was too large, too full, too loud for that. But there was a ripple, a shift, the way a current changes when something enters the water, and within 30 seconds every head in the room had found them. Cecily looked straight ahead. Edmund stood beside her, and she was aware of him as she moved into the room, the particular solidity of him, the fact of him there, which was not something she was leaning on, but something she was aware of, the way you are aware of the ground under your feet when you are walking somewhere that matters. Lady Sefton herself appeared within 2 minutes. She was a woman of considerable social intelligence and the specific kind of courage that manifests as curiosity, and she came directly to them with her eyes bright and her smile sharp and said, "Miss Vane, how extraordinary. We had understood that I was dead," Cecily said pleasantly. "Yes. It was a misunderstanding. I am sorry for any confusion." Lady Sefton stared at her for just a moment. Then she laughed a genuine, delighted laugh, and took Cecily's arm and said, "My dear girl, you must tell me absolutely everything." She told it. Not everything, not the full private weight of it, not the letters or the debts or the careful cruelty of two men in a room making a calculation, but the shape of it, told simply and clearly and without performance, to Lady Sefton, and then to the small audience that gathered as stories do, which was most of the room within half an hour. She had been taken ill. She had been removed to the country, incorrectly reported as deceased, a family error compounded by circumstance. She had lived a quiet life in Yorkshire. She had come back to London to restore her proper legal standing, which was being handled by the Duke of Renmore's solicitor, the matter being connected to the Ashford family's involvement in her family's affairs some years prior. Simple, clean, true in all its parts. She watched it move through the room, watched the other version, the wrong version, the clerk's version, the version designed to make her look like something she was not, lose its footing and slide and fail to find purchase anywhere. Harriet appeared at her elbow at some point, having arrived separately and attached herself with the quiet efficiency that Cecily was beginning to understand was her sister's primary mode of being useful. "It's working," Harriet said quietly. "Of course it is," Cecily said. "The truth usually does if you say it loudly enough." Edmund found her an hour later, near the windows at the far end of the room. The worst of it was over, she could feel that, the way you can feel a weather system moving through. The room had processed the information and reached its conclusions and moved on to other things, because rooms always do, because a live woman is only marginally more interesting than a dead one once the initial shock has been absorbed. He stood beside her and looked out at the room. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. A pause. "Barlow's clerk has been dismissed," he said. "Barlow himself has been," he paused. "Sufficiently addressed. Good. The legal process will take another few weeks. Barlow estimates, Edmund." "Yes. Can we not," she said, "for approximately 10 minutes discuss anything that is not logistics?" He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, the careful management of it, always so precise, coming undone slightly at the edges in the way it had been doing. She had noticed more frequently in recent weeks. "What would you like to discuss?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I would like to stand here for 10 minutes and not discuss anything." "All right." They stood there. The room moved around them, conversation, laughter, the particular music of a London evening in full swing, and they stood at the window and said nothing, and it was the most comfortable silence Cecily had stood inside in 17 years. "Cecily," he said after a while. "I know you said, Edmund, I know, 10 minutes, 8 more." He was quiet. Then very quietly, "I am going to ask you something when the 8 minutes are up." "I know," she said. "You know what I'm going to ask." "I have known for approximately 3 weeks." A pause, and 7 more minutes, she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She kept her eyes on the room, but she was smiling, actually smiling properly, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, and she did not try to stop it. He asked her in the carriage on the way home. Not on one knee, there was insufficient room, and besides, she had told him once at 19 that she found the convention absurd, that she could not imagine why a declaration of intent required a man to make himself uncomfortable on a floor. He had remembered this, apparently. He had remembered it for 17 years. He simply turned to face her in the dim carriage, with the London streets moving past outside and Harriet very studiously looking out of the opposite window, and said, "Cecily, will you marry me?" She looked at him. She thought about yes. She thought about how easy it would be to say yes, how much she wanted to say yes, had wanted it for longer than she was entirely comfortable admitting. She thought about 17 years, about everything that had been taken and everything that had been built in the taking, about who she was now and who he was now, and whether those two people, real and complicated and carrying the full weight of everything that had happened to them, could actually ask me again, she said. "In a month." Edmund looked at her. "A month." She stopped, Found the honest version of it. I'm not the girl you knew. You are not the man I knew. I need a little more time to know who we actually are, before I say yes to something that should last the rest of our lives. You said yes, he noted. You said before I say yes. She looked at him steadily. I said ask me in a month. That is not a no. No, she agreed. It is not a no. He held her gaze for a long moment. A month, he said. A month. He turned back to face forward. Outside, London went about its indifferent business. Harriet continued to look with great interest at nothing in particular out of her window. After a moment, Edmund said, 30 days. Edmund, I am merely establishing parameters. Cecily looked at his profile. At the set of his jaw, the slight curve at the corner of his mouth that he was attempting to suppress. 29, she said. He turned to look at her. She met his eyes. And this time she let the smile happen fully, without managing it, without the careful discipline of 17 years. Just the actual thing, unconstrained, arriving on her face the way it always had when she was 19 and happy, and did not yet know that happiness required protecting. He looked at her as though she was the most interesting thing in any room she had ever entered. Some things, she thought, did not change. She went home that night and sat alone in the Mayfair house after Harriet had gone to bed, and she took her mother's last letter from the small case she had brought from Yorkshire, the one that had arrived 3 weeks after Lady Vane's death, written in the last week of her life and sent through Harriet, 4 pages in a hand that shook in the final lines. She had read it once, on the journey south, and then put it away. She read it now. Her mother had written about the debts and the Duke and the arrangement, much of which Cecily now knew from other sources. She had written about the flowers sent at Christmas, anonymous, which Cecily now knew the origin of. She had written about Harriet, about the grave, the March visits, the flowers, with a grief that Cecily recognized as genuine and found she could not entirely harden herself against. And at the end, in the shaking hand of the last pages, I told myself you would be safer away from all of it. I told myself a quiet life was still a life. I told myself that what I was doing was love in some form, even a damaged form, and perhaps love can be that broken and still be love. I do not know. I know only that I have thought about you every day for 17 years and that I am not asking you to forgive me. I know what I did. I am only asking you to know that I knew it too, that I never stopped knowing it. That whatever peace I find at the end, I find it without having earned it. Your mother. Cecily sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about forgiveness, what it was, what it cost, who it was actually for. She thought about a woman sending anonymous flowers every December to a daughter she had erased, which was one of the most useless and most human things she had ever heard of. She folded the letter. She put it back in the case. She did not close the case yet. She sat with it open on the table in front of her in the quiet London house. In the new year of a new life she was still learning the shape of, and she thought for a long time about the difference between forgiveness and peace, and whether you could have the second without quite managing the first. She thought she might be able to. She thought it might take a while. She closed the case. She went to bed. She slept well. Renmore, October 1824. The wedding was small. This had been Cecily's decision, made early and without negotiation. She had been the subject of enough public interest in the preceding months to last her considerable time, and she had no desire to stand in a London church and be examined by 300 people who had spent the better part of the year discussing her. Edmund had agreed without argument, which she had noted and appreciated. They were married on a Saturday morning in the village church near Renmore, with Harriet as witness and Lord Bexley standing beside Edmund with the expression of a man who has been waiting for this for 20 years and intends to enjoy every moment of it. The vicar was brief. The sun came through the old windows at an angle that turned everything briefly gold. Cecily wore deep green. She had been told ivory was traditional. She had considered this information and set it aside. Edmund had asked her, as promised, 29 days after the carriage. She had said yes. She had said it simply, without drama, in the small sitting room in Mayfair on a Tuesday afternoon, with tea going cold on the table between them. He had taken her hand and held it and not said anything for a long moment, and she had understood, in the silence, the full dimension of what the yes meant to both of them. They did not discuss the 17 years again after that. Not because it was forgotten, not because it had ceased to matter, but because they had said what needed to be said in Yorkshire and in London and in all the months between, and continuing to say it would have been a way of living inside it rather than past it, and they had both had enough of living inside it. They carried it. They simply did not carry it aloud. Harriet stayed in London, which suited her and suited Cecily, who had decided in the course of 10 months that her sister was one of the most capable people she had ever encountered, and that having her at a distance she could reach in a day was among the better arrangements of her new life. She visited Renmore for a month in the summer, ate Edmund's cook-out of house and home, reorganized the library in a way Edmund protested, and then quietly admitted was an improvement, and returned to London with the satisfied air of someone who has done exactly what was needed. Mrs. Holt died in March peacefully in the cottage in Yorkshire. Cecily had visited her in February alone, taking the North Road in the early winter light with a particular purposefulness. They had sat together for 3 days, not speaking of everything, not needing to. On the last morning, Mrs. Holt had held Cecily's hand and looked at her with those sharp, dark eyes and said, "You are all right." It was not a question. "Yes," Cecily said. "Good," said Mrs. Holt, and seemed at last satisfied. Cecily had the cottage kept on. She was not certain why. She thought perhaps she simply did not want it to belong to a stranger. In October, a year after Harriet had arrived at Renmore's door with 7 words that had stopped Edmund's heart, Cecily stood in the garden of Renmore House in the autumn light and looked at the grounds and thought about lists. She had made so many lists in the past year. Things to be done, people to be faced, legal matters to be resolved, conversations to be had. She had moved through all of them with the systematic focus of a woman who had been underestimated for 17 years and had decided to be finished with it. The lists were done now. She was not certain, standing in the October garden with the leaves turning and the air sharp and clean, what she did with herself when there were no more lists. She thought she might find out. Edmund came out of the house and across the lawn toward her with his coat on against the chill and 2 cups of tea that were already cooling in the October air, which was inefficient, but she had stopped mentioning it. He handed her a cup. He stood beside her and looked at the grounds. "The south field boundary needs attention," he said. "I know. I spoke to Harris about it yesterday. And the roof on the east wing next spring. It's on the list." He looked at her. "You have a list." "I always have a list." "Of course you do." She drank her tea. The garden was quiet around them, the particular quiet of a place that has been inhabited for a long time and has settled into itself, all its edges worn smooth. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the school." "Which school?" "There isn't one. That's what I'm thinking about." She looked at the south field. "The tenants' children. There are 11 of them of teaching age. They have nothing." Edmund was quiet for a moment. She could feel him doing the thing he did, turning the idea over, examining it, finding the shape of it. "You want to establish a school on the estate." "I want to teach," she said simply. "It is what I do. I am good at it. And there is a perfectly adequate outbuilding near the home farm that is doing nothing useful." He looked at her. She looked back. 11 children, he said, to begin with. "To begin with," he repeated. The corner of his mouth moved. "Of course." She turned back to the garden. The leaves were coming down in the light slowly in that unhurried October way, and the grounds of Renmore stretched out before her in the afternoon sun, her home, she thought, allowing herself to think it without qualification. Her home, her life, the man beside her, hers. She had been hidden for 17 years. She had been angry about it for 17 years, and she had been right to be angry, and she was done being angry now. She had come back. She had taken her name from a death certificate and worn it again, and it fit differently than before, the way everything fits differently when you have grown into it through difficulty rather than ease, but it fit. She was here. She was, in all the ways that mattered, entirely and irrevocably herself. "Edmund," she said. 30 days was perfectly sufficient, as it turned out. He was quiet for a moment. 29, he said. She smiled. She did not try to stop it. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.